Where there is success, there are always secrets lurking beneath the surface. We often see celebrities, business moguls, and industry leaders celebrated for their achievements and impressive results. But what's the real story behind those glamorous facades? There's one story about a man who is not only famous for his talent, but also for making bold decisions that often challenge the status quo. He's someone not many people are unfamiliar with. Vin Diesel, the action star known for conquering audiences worldwide with his roles in blockbuster films. But few realize that, beyond the silver screen, he's also a restaurateur and a man whose decisions can profoundly affect the lives of others. Surely, you'll be surprised to learn that one of Vin Diesel's most impactful decisions didn't come from a movie set, but from an ordinary evening at his own restaurant. It was a night with no special preparations, no script to follow, and no spotlight. It was the moment when Vin Diesel, the superstar, walked into his own restaurant not as a famous figure, but as just another diner. The story begins one ordinary night when Vin Diesel decides to visit his own upscale restaurant, Torx, located in the heart of Los Angeles. There were no flashing lights or blaring music in the background, just him and the quiet ambience of a restaurant bustling with guests. But behind the opulent tables and grand settings, a disturbing truth was unfolding in the shadows, one that few could have imagined. And it was in that moment that Vin Diesel realized success wasn't about numbers, business strategies, or flashy signs. What truly made or broke a restaurant was what was happening behind the scenes, where the staff, the people who created the atmosphere, might be enduring things nobody could see. A sigh, a glance full of worry, a door quietly closing, hiding pain that had no words. A young waitress, one of the employees at his restaurant, was quietly crying in the staff room. Vin Diesel heard it and immediately recognized that not everything was as it seemed. Now, you might be wondering, why would someone like Vin Diesel, famous and wealthy, care about something so seemingly trivial? Why didn't he just focus on his own work and let things run like a machine, as long as the money kept flowing into his bank account? But it's in moments like this that we see the true nature of a leader. What did Vin Diesel do when he realized that his restaurant was not only dealing with the challenges of management and business efficiency, but was also facing issues of power abuse and toxic environments? This isn't just a story of one employee crying quietly in a corner. This is the story of a system that was broken, of a workplace culture that was deteriorating, and of people who were struggling to find an escape in a world where they had no voice. Vin Diesel wasn't the first person to notice this, but he was the one brave enough to confront and change it. And the question we all need to ask ourselves is, would you have the courage to do the same? Would you be able to look beyond the numbers and results and listen to the stories of the people, those quiet tears, those heavy sighs, that you could hear if you only took the time to listen? In the next part of this story, we will dive deeper into the real issues behind power abuse in workplaces and the valuable lessons that Vin Diesel, along with the employees of Torx, learned on that challenging night. By the end of this story, you'll see leadership in a new light. You'll understand that true leadership isn't just about managing systems and making profits. It's about creating a space where people feel heard, valued, and respected. As the night wore on and the restaurant buzzed with the hum of dinner service, Vin Diesel's attention shifted from the lively atmosphere of Torx to a quieter, more unsettling detail, the muffled sound of someone crying. He was no longer just a visitor at his restaurant, he was a witness to something much deeper, a pattern of abuse that had quietly woven itself into the daily fabric of his establishment. Vin Diesel didn't have to be told what was happening. He'd been in the industry long enough to recognize the signs, the subtle body language, the way people lowered their eyes when they spoke, the exhausted, drained faces of employees who seemed to be living on autopilot. These were the signals that a toxic environment was flourishing behind the scenes, far from the customer's view. What surprised him, though, was the fact that he, the owner, had failed to notice it sooner. The crying employee was just one of many voices drowned out by the everyday chaos of running a high-end restaurant. But this wasn't just a case of workplace stress or exhaustion, where employees were simply overworked. There was something far more sinister at play, something that had been brewing quietly and unchallenged for months, perhaps even years. The manager, Rick Calloway, was at the center of it all. His presence was more than just authoritative, it was suffocating. His sharp eyes scanned the room, not to observe, but to control. His posture rigid. He loomed over the employees, casting an intimidating shadow that made even the most seasoned workers feel small and powerless. But it wasn't just his overbearing attitude that was problematic. It was the way he manipulated people into feeling trapped, powerless, and afraid. The real story wasn't just about harsh management. It was about exploitation, fear, and intimidation, things that went far beyond regular work stress. Let's pause here and take a moment to consider something crucial. We often think of toxic work environments as places where the pressure is high and the hours are long. But there's another layer to it. The way people in power, managers, bosses, executives, can manipulate their positions to make their employees feel indebted, trapped, or forced to comply. In Vin's case, he was dealing with a man who used his influence not just to enforce policies, but to bully and intimidate employees who had no choice but to stay. One of the most heartbreaking things about this scenario was that Emily, the waitress who had been crying in the break room, didn't see a way out. She couldn't afford to leave. She had bills to pay, and a job like hers, under the abusive control of someone like Calloway, was the only option she could see. But the reality was much darker. Calloway wasn't just a strict manager, he was a predator. He knew how to manipulate his staff's vulnerabilities to his advantage. And Emily wasn't alone. Other employees, like Tyler and Nate, also carried the weight of fear and helplessness. Tyler, when questioned by Vin, hesitated to speak up. His fear wasn't just about being reprimanded. He was scared of losing his job, of being ostracized, of facing retaliation. Nate, the bartender, also saw the same toxic behavior, but like everyone else, he was stuck in the system, unsure of how to fight back. This is a situation that many people can relate to. How many of us have worked in environments where the culture felt off, but we didn't know how to address it? How many times have we stayed quiet in the face of injustice, whether out of fear, financial necessity, or simply not knowing what could be done? It's a pattern that plays out far too often in workplaces across the world, not just in restaurants or entertainment, but in all sectors. What's often the most insidious part of these toxic work cultures is the way they subtly erode people's sense of self-worth and agency. Employees like Emily weren't just afraid. They had been conditioned to believe that they had no other options, no way out. It was a slow, painful process, where small compromises added up until they were trapped in a cycle of fear, stress, and exhaustion. They began to see themselves not as workers with rights, but as tools to be used and discarded. Vin Diesel could have easily walked away. He could have dismissed the incident as a one-off or chalked it up to the pressures of the restaurant industry. After all, most restaurant owners rarely interact with the staff beyond managerial meetings, let alone go undercover to observe the daily struggles their employees face. But Vin was different. He understood that leadership wasn't just about overseeing operations or ensuring profits. True leadership was about creating an environment where people felt safe, valued, and respected. At this point, many might question, why didn't someone speak up earlier? Why didn't the employees report the manager's behavior to HR or take action before it escalated? The answer lies in the culture of fear and power imbalance that had been allowed to fester. In these types of environments, Employees are often afraid to speak out because they know the consequences: retaliation, humiliation, or even job loss. It's in moments like these that we see the true weight of leadership. The people in charge have the power to create an environment that nurtures people or one that breaks them down. And it's not always the glaring, obvious cases of abuse that hurt people the most. It's the subtle, unspoken moments where power dynamics shift ever so slightly until it's too late. Vin Diesel could have left the situation unresolved. He could have simply confronted the manager and gone on with his life. But that wouldn't have fixed the systemic problem at Torx. No, Vin knew this was about more than just one bad manager or one employee. This was about changing the entire culture of the restaurant, and perhaps even changing how we view leadership and power in workplaces everywhere. When Vin decided to act, he didn't just confront Calloway. He didn't just address the crying employee in the break room. He took steps to uncover the broader issue: a culture of control, manipulation, and fear. This wasn't just about one bad employee, it was about a system that allowed such behavior to thrive. But before Vin could make the necessary changes, he needed to understand the full scope of the problem. He needed to hear from the employees themselves. And in a moment of honesty and vulnerability, Nate revealed the truth. It wasn't just Calloway. It was the entire environment, the pressure, the fear of speaking out, the constant feeling of being trapped. The problem wasn't just about one abusive manager. It was about a toxic culture that permeated the restaurant, from the top down. This was the turning point in the story. This is where things began to shift, where Vin realized that true leadership wasn't about asserting control, but about dismantling the systems that allowed fear and abuse to flourish. The next part of the story is where Vin Diesel's leadership truly shines. He wasn't just concerned with punishing a bad manager. He was determined to rebuild the culture of his restaurant from the ground up. And that would require more than just one conversation with an employee. It would require real, systemic change. After a long and intense conversation with the employees, Vin Diesel knew that the real work had just begun. The toxic environment that had festered in his restaurant for so long couldn't be eradicated overnight. It would take time, dedication, and a profound shift in how leadership was approached. This wasn't just about addressing one individual or one incident. It was about changing the entire framework of how employees were treated and ensuring that a culture of respect, transparency, and mutual support would replace the toxic atmosphere that had been allowed to thrive. Vin had spent years in Hollywood, where on-set dynamics could often be just as high-pressure and stressful as any restaurant kitchen. But what he realized, and what so many others overlook, is that being a leader doesn't just mean being the boss. It means being a true support system for your team, knowing when to be firm and when to be compassionate, and recognizing that a thriving team is far more valuable than short-term profits. The first thing Vin did was address the issue directly with Calloway. The conversation wasn't easy. Calloway's arrogance was palpable, and for a moment, it seemed as though he would try to deflect blame, deny the accusations, or continue with his manipulative behavior. But Vin didn't back down. He didn't come in as a star or an outsider. He came in as an owner who was determined to take accountability for what had been happening under his watch. "Rick," Vin began, his voice calm but firm, "what's been happening here? It's not just your responsibility, it's mine. I've let this place become a breeding ground for fear and mistrust. But I'm done letting that slide." Rick had no choice but to listen. The tone of Vin's voice wasn't just that of an employer. It was a leader who recognized his own role in the toxic culture. This wasn't about passing blame. It was about recognizing that leadership is shared responsibility. And in that moment, Vin understood that the most powerful tool in his leadership arsenal wasn't his ability to command or dominate. It was his willingness to be open, honest, and accountable. But Vin's conversation with Calloway wasn't just about addressing the toxic behavior. It was also about confronting the core issue, a leadership model based on fear, intimidation, and control. In many ways, this was the flaw that had allowed the restaurant to remain a hostile environment for so long. Vin realized that the old ways of managing people weren't working, not just for his employees, but for the long-term success of Torx itself. The next step was setting clear boundaries and expectations. Employees needed to feel safe again, and that started with the restoration of trust. Vin had to ensure that every single employee knew they could come forward, speak up, and be heard. To foster that environment, he began hosting weekly meetings where anyone could voice their concerns, suggestions, or frustrations without fear of retaliation. These weren't just lip service meetings where employees were forced to sit quietly. They were active, collaborative conversations aimed at rebuilding the team's cohesion and transparency. But this wasn't just about the employees on the ground level. It was about the leadership team, too. Vin understood that the change had to start from the top. He knew that if the managers, like Calloway, were allowed to maintain their positions without significant changes in behavior, nothing would improve. So Vin took the difficult decision to let Calloway go. This wasn't a decision driven by malice, but by the recognition that leadership can't thrive in an environment of abuse. Calloway's methods simply didn't align with Vin's vision for the future. The aftermath of Calloway's departure was profound. At first, there was some hesitation and uncertainty. Employees, especially those who had worked under Calloway's thumb for so long, were unsure about what would happen next. But as time passed, they began to feel a renewed sense of hope. They started to see that their voices mattered, that their well-being was important, and that their hard work was valued. Vin didn't just stop at firing Calloway. He began to restructure the leadership team with a focus on empathy, collaboration, and fairness. He knew that, just like any high-performing team, the restaurant needed a sense of unity, where everyone, from the servers to the chefs to the front-of-house staff, felt like they were part of something bigger than themselves. He began mentoring his managers, encouraging them to develop a leadership style that was built on trust, transparency, and respect for their teams. But perhaps one of the most significant changes came in the form of leadership development programs for all employees. Vin recognized that when employees feel empowered and invested in, they become more than just workers. They become partners in the restaurant's success. He wanted to ensure that every person in Torx felt like they had the opportunity to grow and develop their skills. This wasn't just about creating a more supportive work environment. It was about setting the groundwork for a new culture that would lead to greater employee retention, better morale, and ultimately, greater customer satisfaction. The impact of these changes wasn't immediate, but over time, the atmosphere at Torx began to transform. Employees felt less fearful and more confident in their roles. They began to engage with customers more enthusiastically, and the restaurant itself saw an increase in both employee satisfaction and customer reviews. It wasn't just about making the restaurant a better place to work. It was about creating a space where everyone could thrive. Reflecting on the journey, Vin couldn't help but see the larger lesson that had come out of this experience. It wasn't just about fixing a toxic work culture in one restaurant. It was about challenging the assumptions and structures that allowed such cultures to thrive in the first place. This was a wake-up call for the entire industry and for anyone in a position of power. Leadership is about much more than authority. It's about responsibility, empathy, and understanding the impact that your actions have on the people around you. Vin Diesel's experience at Torx, though not what anyone would have expected from a celebrity-turned-restaurateur, provides a powerful reminder of how crucial it is to foster an environment where respect, compassion, and fairness are the foundational values. It's not enough to simply focus on the bottom line. Leaders must also invest in the well-being of their employees. In the end, This story isn't just about one man's journey to change the culture of his restaurant. It's about the power of leadership to drive meaningful change, not through fear, control, or intimidation, but through understanding, support, and shared growth. It's a story of accountability, vulnerability, and, above all, a commitment to making things right. As we wrap up this story, let's remember the fundamental truth. Leadership isn't about being in charge. It's about taking care of those in your charge. True leaders recognize the responsibility they have not just to run a business, but to create a place where everyone, from the top to the bottom, feels safe, valued, and empowered. Now it's your turn. If you're ever in a position where you see someone struggling, whether it's in your workplace or in life, don't turn away. Speak up. Be the voice for those who can't speak for themselves. You might just be the one to break the cycle and change someone's life for the better. And if you've ever faced a similar situation, where power was abused or you felt trapped, remember, you have the strength to stand up. You have the right to speak your truth. I want to hear your stories. Let us know in the comments below if you've ever stood up for what's right or if you've had to deal with toxic leadership. Share your experiences and let's build a community of support and change. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. The more we talk about it, the more we can make a difference. Remember, leadership isn't about control. It's about responsibility. Let's hold ourselves and others accountable. Together, we can make a difference.